The sun hung like molten iron in the sky, beating down on the cracked earth with relentless fury. Heat waves shimmered across the desert floor, distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage of false water and phantom trees. The cowboy had been riding since before first light, when the stars still clung to the darkness and the air held a trace of coolness that vanished the moment the sun cleared the mountains. His horse, a sturdy roan mare that had carried him through 3 territories and countless miles of wilderness, moved with the patient endurance of an animal bred for survival in harsh lands. The canteen that hung from his saddle horn had grown lighter with each passing hour. He rationed the water carefully, knowing that the next reliable source lay at least another day's ride to the north. The leather of his saddle creaked with each step, a familiar sound that marked the rhythm of his solitary journey. He was a man accustomed to silence, to the vast emptiness of the frontier, to days that passed without the sound of another human voice. The trail he followed was barely visible, just a faint suggestion of passage worn into the hardpan by those who had come before. His thoughts drifted as they often did on long rides, touching on memories of towns left behind, faces half forgotten, and the restless urge that kept him moving ever westward. He had no destination in mind, only the vague notion of finding work at one of the ranches that sprawled across the territory, or perhaps signing on with a cattle drive heading north. The specifics mattered less than the movement itself, the freedom of answering to no one, of choosing his direction each morning when he saddled his horse. It was nearly midday when he first noticed something wrong. A darkness against the sand that didn't belong, that held still while everything else seemed to shimmer and shift in the heat. His first instinct was to dismiss it as another trick of the desert, a shadow cast by clouds that weren't there, or the dark stain of rocks jutting from the earth. But something nagged at him, an unease that made him rein in his horse and shade his eyes against the glare. The shapes resolved slowly as he approached, taking on form and substance until he could no longer deny what he was seeing. 2 figures lay sprawled on the desert floor, small and motionless, their bodies curled against the brutal sun. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he urged his horse forward, his mind already racing through the implications of what he was about to encounter. In this territory, finding someone alone and vulnerable in the desert could mean many things, few of them simple, and fewer still without consequence. As he drew closer, details emerged that made his stomach clench with a mixture of concern and wariness. The figures were young, barely more than children, their dark hair tangled with dust and debris. Their clothing, what remained visible beneath the coating of sand, bore the distinctive patterns he recognized immediately. Apache. The word carried weight in these lands, spoken with fear in some towns, with hatred in others, always with caution. The raids that swept down from the mountains, the ambushes along lonely trails, the tales of violence and vengeance that passed between settlers like currency of fear. He sat on his horse for a long moment, weighing his options with the cold calculation that survival in the West demanded. Riding on would be the sensible choice. These were not his people, not his responsibility, and the complications that came with involving himself in their affairs could follow him for years. Every rancher and townsman he might seek work from would hear the story eventually. They always did. News traveled across the frontier on invisible wings, carried by traders and drifters, growing with each retelling until truth and fiction blended into something else entirely. Yet something held him there, staring down at those still forms. Perhaps it was the memory of his own brush with death in this same desert, years ago when he'd been green and foolish, when only the kindness of a stranger had kept him from becoming another set of bones bleaching under the sun. Perhaps it was something simpler, more fundamental, a refusal to let death claim an easy victory when he had the power to intervene. Whatever the reason, he found himself swinging down from his saddle, his boots hitting the sand with a soft thud that sent up small clouds of dust. The first girl lay flat on her back, her chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. Her skin had taken on a grayish cast beneath its natural brown tone, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from the brutal combination of heat and dehydration. He knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently, and she stirred with a weak moan but didn't open her eyes. The second girl had rolled onto her side, one arm flung out toward her companion as if reaching for help that never came. She was conscious, barely, her eyes flickering open when his shadow fell across her face. Those eyes held no fear, only a desperate, animal need for survival. She tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged from her parched throat. The cowboy unslung his canteen and shook it, hearing the disappointing slosh of water that amounted to perhaps 3 or 4 swallows. Not enough for one person to make the journey to safety, let alone 3. He looked up at the sky, judging the angle of the sun and the distance still to travel. The calculations were grim, but he'd faced worse odds before. He tilted the canteen to the conscious girl's lips, letting a small amount of water trickle into her mouth. She swallowed convulsively, greedily, trying to gulp more than he would allow. He pulled back, moving to her companion, and repeated the process. The unconscious girl choked at first, then her body's instincts took over and she managed to swallow. A small amount, barely enough to wet her throat, but enough to keep her alive a while longer. The cowboy stood and surveyed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who had faced countless crises on the trail. The girls needed shelter from the sun, water in quantities he didn't possess, and transport they couldn't provide for themselves. His horse could carry additional weight, but not for long, and not quickly. He pulled his coat from behind his saddle, a worn leather duster that had seen him through mountain winters and prairie storms, and draped it over the girls to provide some shade. Then came the difficult part. He lifted the first girl, the one who had been conscious, and was struck by how light she was. Too light, her body wasted by days without proper food and water. He settled her across the saddle, then went back for her companion. The second girl was even lighter, her frame delicate as bird bones beneath his hands. He positioned them both carefully, making sure they wouldn't slide off when the horse began to move, then gathered the reins and began to walk. The journey back was an exercise in endurance and will. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, the heat pressing down on him like a physical weight. Sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes, running in rivulets down his face and back. His throat burned with thirst, but he ignored it, focusing instead on placing one foot in front of the other, on keeping the horse moving steadily forward, on checking every few minutes to ensure the girls still breathed. The temptation to drink the last of the water gnawed at him constantly. His body screamed for it, his mind conjuring vivid images of the cool liquid sliding down his throat, bringing relief to the fire that burned there. But each time he reached for the canteen, he stopped himself, thinking of the 2 lives depending on his continued strength. If he collapsed out here, all 3 of them would die. Better to push through the agony and save the water for a true emergency. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of sand and scrub brush punctuated by the occasional twisted tree or cluster of rocks. The sun moved across the sky with agonizing slowness, marking the passage of hours that felt like days. The cowboy's legs grew heavy, each step requiring conscious effort, but he maintained his pace through sheer stubbornness. He had survived worse than this. He would survive this too. His thoughts drifted as he walked, entering that strange state between waking and sleeping where time loses meaning and the body operates on autopilot. He thought of his childhood, of the farm back east where he'd been born, of the circumstances that had driven him west into this unforgiving land. He thought of the men he'd known, the few friendships formed and dissolved over campfires and card games. He thought of the women he'd loved briefly and lost, not to death but to the demands of his restless nature. None of those memories had prepared him for this moment, for the weight of responsibility he now carried. In saving these girls, he was committing himself to something he couldn't yet name, something that went beyond simple mercy. He sensed it in the heaviness that settled over his shoulders, in the way the air itself seemed to thicken with portent. But he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the immediate crisis of keeping them all alive. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when his cabin finally came into view. It sat at the base of a low rise, backed by rocks that provided some protection from the wind and a measure of privacy from passing travelers. The structure was simple, built by his own hands from whatever materials he could scavenge or purchase. For walls, a roof that mostly kept out the rain, a single room that served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space. It wasn't much, but it was his, and at this moment it represented salvation. He led the horse to the small stable he'd constructed, little more than a three-sided shed with a water trough and a rail for tying animals. His hands shook as he lifted the first girl down from the saddle, carrying her inside and laying her gently on his cot. The second girl followed, and he arranged them side by side, their heads on his single pillow, his blanket pulled up to their chins despite the lingering heat. Inside the cabin, the air was marginally cooler, protected from direct sunlight by the thick walls. He had a rain barrel outside that still held water from the last storm, and he dipped bucket after bucket, bringing it inside to pour into his basin. He soaked cloth scraps and pressed them to the girls' faces, necks, and arms, trying to bring down their body temperature. Their skin felt like fire beneath his touch, radiating heat that spoke of severe sun exposure and possible fever. The unconscious girl showed signs of waking, her eyelids fluttering, soft moans escaping her cracked lips. Her companion had slipped into unconsciousness as well, her body surrendering to exhaustion now that it no longer needed to fight for survival. The cowboy worked methodically, drawing on every scrap of knowledge he'd accumulated over years of treating injuries in remote places. He'd seen men survive bullet wounds and snake bites, fevers and broken bones, all without benefit of a doctor. The girl's condition was serious, but not hopeless. He wet their lips carefully, letting tiny amounts of water seep into their mouths. Too much at once and they might choke or vomit, wasting precious fluid their bodies desperately needed. He tilted their heads gently, supporting them as their throats worked to swallow. It was painstaking work, requiring patience and attention, but gradually he saw improvement. Their breathing became more regular, their skin began to lose that frightening grayish tinge. As darkness fell outside, the cowboy lit his lantern and set it on the table. The yellow light cast long shadows across the walls, making the small cabin feel even more enclosed. He sat in his chair, the only piece of furniture besides the cot, and let exhaustion wash over him. His body ached in every joint, his muscles trembling from the sustained effort of the day. His own thirst had become a constant torment, but he'd given most of his remaining water to the girls, keeping only enough for himself to prevent collapse. He thought about the choice he'd made, turning it over in his mind from different angles. Logic said he should have ridden past, should have preserved his own safety and resources. The frontier was harsh and it punished those who let sentiment override sense. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Looking at the girls breathing more easily now, their faces peaceful in sleep, he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, perhaps, or meaning. The sense that his life had value beyond mere survival. The hours crawled by as he kept watch. He got up periodically to check on his patients, to wet their lips with more water, to adjust the cloths cooling their skin. He tended the fire, keeping it low for warmth as the desert night turned cold, a shift in temperature that never failed to surprise those unfamiliar with this land. He thought about what might come with the morning, about the questions that would need answering, about the complications he'd invited into his simple existence. Around midnight, the conscious girl's eyes opened fully for the first time. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then turned her head slowly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her gaze found the cowboy sitting in his chair, rifle across his lap, and for several heartbeats they simply looked at each other. He saw fear flicker in her expression, followed by confusion, and finally a cautious acceptance. She understood, he realized. Understood that he'd saved them, that she was safe, at least for now. She spoke a few words in her language, soft and questioning. He shook his head, spreading his hands to show he didn't understand. She fell silent, her eyes never leaving his face, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. What did she see, he wondered. A white man who might still prove dangerous despite his mercy? A stranger whose motivations remained unclear? Or simply another human being doing what any decent person would do? The girl's companion stirred, murmuring something in her sleep. The first girl reached out weakly, finding her sister's hand and holding it. The gesture spoke of a bond that went beyond ordinary friendship, a connection forged by shared blood and shared trials. Sisters, the cowboy realized. He'd saved sisters and taken on whatever obligations came with that act. As the night deepened, the cowboy allowed himself to doze, his body demanding rest even as his mind remained alert to potential danger. He jerked awake at every sound, hand moving to his rifle, but each time it was only the normal noises of the night. Wind rattling the walls, his horse shifting in the stable, the creaks and groans of wood settling. Nothing threatening, nothing immediate, yet he couldn't fully relax. Dawn broke with surprising gentleness, the sun rising in a wash of pale gold that painted the desert in softer hues than the harsh glare of midday. The cowboy woke fully, stiff from sleeping in his chair, his back protesting as he stood and stretched. The girls still slept, their breathing deep and even, their color vastly improved from the day before. They would live, he was certain of it now. The crisis had passed. He stepped outside to breathe the cool morning air, to feel the breeze on his face and gather his thoughts for the day ahead. He needed to fetch more water from the barrel, needed to see if he had any food suitable for invalids recovering from severe dehydration. He needed to decide what to do next, whether to try finding their people or keeping them here until they were strong enough to travel. He needed to think about all these things, but his mind felt sluggish, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the strangeness of his situation. That's when he heard it. Footsteps in the sand, approaching from the south, the direction from which he'd rescued the girls. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver, then froze as the figure emerged from the morning haze. A woman, walking with deliberate purpose, her bearing erect despite obvious signs of hard travel. She was Apache, that much was clear from her dress and the way she moved, and she was heading directly for his cabin. The cowboy's mind raced, calculating possibilities and potential outcomes. This could be the girl's mother, come searching for her lost daughters. It could be a warrior woman, intent on revenge for some perceived wrong. It could be a tribal elder, bringing judgment or blessing. Whatever the case, he knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict or control. He stood his ground, hand resting on his gun but not drawing it, as the woman covered the final yards to his property. She stopped at what might be considered a respectful distance, neither threatening nor submissive, and looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. Her face was weathered by sun and years, lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes, but there was a strength in her features that commanded respect. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cowboy felt the weight of her scrutiny, felt himself being measured and judged by standards he didn't understand. Then slowly, deliberately, she bowed her head in a gesture that struck him with unexpected force. It wasn't a bow of defeat or servitude, but something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement. The granting of respect from one worthy individual to another. When she straightened, she held something in her hands, a bundle wrapped in cloth that she'd been carrying hidden against her body. She knelt and placed it on the ground between them, then unwrapped it with careful, reverent movements. The object inside gleamed in the early light, catching colors and throwing them back transformed. It was carved from bone or antler, inlaid with stones that might have been turquoise, formed into a shape that suggested both weapon and tool, though its true purpose remained mysterious. The woman spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. Her words were in her own language, fluid and musical, but somehow he understood the emotion behind them even without comprehension of the specific meanings. Gratitude. Solemnity. A sense of binding and commitment that transcended mere transaction. Then she switched to broken English, the words clearly difficult but spoken with determination. "My daughters," she said, pointing toward his cabin. "You save them. You bring them from the dying place." She touched her chest, then gestured between them. "Now you are bound. To me. To them. To our people." The cowboy wanted to protest, to explain that he'd acted from simple human decency, not to create obligations or forge connections. He wanted to tell her he was just a drifter, a man without roots or responsibilities, someone who prized his freedom above all else. But the words died in his throat as he looked into her eyes and saw the absolute certainty there. This wasn't a request or an offer. It was a statement of fact, a pronouncement of something that had already occurred the moment he'd lifted those girls onto his horse. "I didn't want anything," he finally managed to say, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. "I just couldn't leave them there." The woman nodded as if she'd expected this response. "This is why," she said. "Why you are chosen. Why the bond is strong." She gestured to the carved object. "This is mark of honor. You keep. You remember. When you need help, you call. We come." The magnitude of what she was offering began to sink in. In a land where Apache raids kept settlers in constant fear, where military campaigns and reprisals had painted both sides in blood, she was extending protection and alliance. It was a gift beyond price, and also a burden he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. To be known as a friend to the Apache would mark him in certain circles as a traitor, a man who'd chosen the wrong side in an ongoing conflict. Yet looking at her, at the dignity and strength she embodied, he found he couldn't refuse. Whatever his reservations, whatever complications might arise, he sensed that rejecting this offering would be not just an insult but a violation of something sacred. Some opportunities came only once, and the decision to accept or refuse shaped everything that followed. He bent and picked up the carved object, feeling its weight in his palm, its surface smooth from countless hands that had held it before. The stones caught the light and threw it back in flashes of blue and green. He didn't know what it represented, didn't understand the symbols carved into the bone, but he felt the power it carried, the accumulated meaning of traditions older than his understanding. "I accept," he said simply, meeting her eyes. "I will honor this." The woman's face softened slightly, something that might have been relief or satisfaction crossing her features. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch the object in his hand, then his hand itself, a brief contact that sealed whatever bargain they'd just made. Then she moved past him toward his cabin, and he didn't try to stop her. Inside, the girls had woken at the sound of voices. They sat up on the cot, still weak but alert, their faces transforming with joy when they saw the woman in the doorway. They cried out in their language, reaching for her, and she went to them with a mother's urgency, gathering them into her arms and murmuring words of comfort and relief. The cowboy stood in the doorway, watching the reunion, feeling like an intruder in his own home yet also somehow part of this moment. The three of them spoke rapidly, the girls gesturing toward him, the mother listening intently while never releasing her hold on her daughters. Occasionally one of the girls would break into tears, and the mother would smooth her hair and whisper more soothing words. The cowboy understood none of it, but the emotional content needed no translation. Terror survived, family reunited, gratitude expressed. After several minutes, the mother looked up at him and spoke in English again. "They tell me what you do. The water. The walking. How you sacrifice for them." She paused, searching for words. "No white man does this thing. No white man risks for Apache daughters. You are different. You are honorable." The praise made him uncomfortable. He'd done what anyone should do, what basic human decency demanded. But he was beginning to understand that in this divided land, such actions were rarer than they should be. Too many people saw only enemies, only threats, only reasons to harden their hearts and turn away. By refusing that hardness, he'd crossed a line that few in his position would dare to approach. "They needed help," he said with a shrug. "That's all." The mother smiled, an expression that transformed her face, making her look years younger. "You say this is all. But it is everything. You choose life over fear. You choose compassion over safety. This is why the bond is given." She helped her daughters to their feet, supporting them on either side. They were still weak, still needed days of rest and proper food, but they could walk. The mother looked around the cabin, taking in its sparse furnishings, the evidence of a solitary life lived on the margins. Then she looked at the cowboy with something like understanding. "You live alone," she observed. "No family. No ties." He nodded. "That's how I prefer it. Free to move when I want, no one depending on me." "This is what you think," she said. "But now you have family. You have ties. You have people who will depend on you, and you can depend on them. This is not prison. This is gift." They moved toward the door, the girls leaning on their mother but managing to walk on their own feet. At the threshold, the older daughter turned back and spoke directly to him for the first time, her voice soft but clear. She said something in her language, then added in halting English, "Thank you. For life." The cowboy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. There was something in her eyes, a combination of gratitude and curiosity and something else he couldn't quite identify, that made his chest tight. She was young, perhaps 16 or 17, on the edge of womanhood but not quite there yet. Her sister appeared slightly younger, 14 or 15. Both had the same dark eyes, the same features that spoke of generations adapting to this harsh land. The mother led them outside, and the cowboy followed. She pointed to the east, where the sun now climbed higher, burning off the cool of morning. 3 days' walk. Our camp. You come, you are welcome. You need help, you come. You want to be alone, we respect. But you remember. You are bound now. You are family." With that, she began walking, her daughters supported on either side, moving slowly but steadily toward the horizon. The cowboy watched them go, the carved object still in his hand, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. His life, which had been so carefully constructed around solitude and independence, had just been fundamentally altered by a single act of mercy. He looked down at the object, turning it over in his palm, studying the craftsmanship and the symbols he couldn't read. It was beautiful in its own way, foreign yet somehow familiar, like a bridge between worlds that rarely touched. He thought about what the woman had said, about bonds and family, about obligations that ran deeper than contracts or agreements. In his world, such things were often burdens, ties that restricted and limited. But the way she described it suggested something different, a web of mutual support that made everyone stronger. The figures grew smaller as they walked into the distance, becoming silhouettes against the brightening day, then mere shapes in the shimmer of heat, then nothing at all. The cowboy stood for a long time after they'd disappeared, trying to sort through his feelings. Confusion, certainly. Uncertainty about what he'd gotten himself into. But also, if he was honest, a strange sense of relief. For years he'd been running from attachments, from the pain they could bring, from the vulnerability of caring about others. Now that a connection had been forced upon him, he found it wasn't as terrifying as he'd always believed. He went back inside, setting the carved object on his makeshift mantel where it caught the light streaming through his window. The cabin felt different now, less empty, as if the presence of the girls and their mother had left something behind beyond physical traces. He busied himself with morning tasks, hauling water, checking his supplies, tending to his horse. But his mind kept returning to the object on the mantel, to the promise it represented, to the future it implied. Over the following days, the cowboy found himself thinking often about his encounter. He tried to return to his normal routines, to the solitary patterns that had defined his existence for so long, but something had shifted. He caught himself looking toward the east, wondering about the camp 3 days' walk away, about the people there, about whether the girls had fully recovered. He wondered if others in their tribe knew about him, if the story of his rescue had spread, if he'd become a figure in their narratives the way they'd become figures in his. He rode into the nearest town for supplies, a 2-day journey that took him through territory he knew well. At the general store, while the clerk tallied his purchases, he heard the usual talk. Indian troubles to the north. Soldiers moving through the territory. Warnings about traveling alone, about the dangers posed by the Apache and other tribes who resisted the inexorable push of settlement and civilization. The cowboy said nothing, but he felt the weight of the carved object, which he'd left hidden back at his cabin, as if he carried it in his pocket. When an old rancher started telling stories about Apache savagery, about raids and massacres, the cowboy found himself speaking up for the first time in such conversations. "They're people," he said quietly. "They're protecting their land, their families. Same as anyone would." The store went silent. The rancher turned to stare at him, face reddening. "You got Apache sympathies, boy?" The cowboy met his gaze steadily. "I got human sympathies. I don't see why that should be controversial." He collected his supplies and left before the situation could escalate, but he knew his words would spread. In a small community, such statements marked a man, defined how others saw him. He'd just declared himself, if not quite an ally of the Apache, then at least someone who refused to demonize them. It would cost him, socially and potentially economically. Some ranchers wouldn't hire him now. Some doors would close. Yet riding back toward his cabin under the vast western sky, he found he didn't care as much as he'd expected. The opinion of people who saw only enemies and threats suddenly mattered less than the memory of two girls who'd been saved because someone chose to see them as human beings first. The abstract political divisions of the territory seemed less important than the concrete reality of lives preserved and connections formed. The seasons turned as they always did in the desert, the brutal heat of summer giving way gradually to autumn's tempering. The cowboy continued his existence on the margins, taking work where he could find it, riding long distances between jobs, returning always to his small cabin. But the solitude felt different now. Less like peaceful independence and more like waiting. For what, he couldn't quite say. A summons, perhaps. A chance to honor the bond that had been created. Or simply to see again those faces that appeared in his thoughts with surprising frequency. It was late October when they came. The cowboy was working in front of his cabin, repairing a section of the stable wall that had come loose in a windstorm, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He straightened, reaching for the rifle he always kept nearby, then relaxed as he recognized the riders. The mother came first, sitting her horse with the same dignity she'd shown on foot. Behind her rode the two daughters, both looking healthier and stronger than the last time he'd seen them, their faces no longer pinched with the memory of near death. They dismounted, and the mother approached him with a slight smile. "We come to see," she said. "To see if you are well. To see if you remember." "I remember," he said, glancing toward his cabin where the carved object still sat on the mantel. "How could I forget?" The older daughter, whose name he'd learned was something that sounded like dancing wind when spoken in English, came forward shyly. She carried a bundle, which she offered to him with both hands. "We bring gift," she said, her English improved since their last meeting. "For the man who gave us life." He unwrapped the bundle to find a shirt, beautifully made from soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that hurt his eyes with their complexity and beauty. He ran his fingers over the work, amazed at the skill and time it must have required. "This is too much," he protested, but the mother shook her head firmly. "A life cannot be repaid," she said. "But it can be honored. You wear this, you carry our gratitude with you." They stayed through the afternoon, and the cowboy found himself enjoying their company more than he'd enjoyed human interaction in years. The mother told him stories of her people, translating the older traditions into English with careful attention to nuance. The younger daughter, whose name approximated to Morning Star, remained quiet but watched everything with bright, curious eyes. And Dancing Wind asked him questions about his life, about where he came from, about what had brought him to this harsh land. He found himself telling them things he'd never spoken aloud before. About his family back east, dead now from fever. About the war he'd fought in, the things he'd seen and done that had made normal life impossible afterward. About the restless drive that kept him moving, always moving, running from ghosts that followed no matter how far he rode. Ghosts cannot be escaped, the mother said when he'd finished. They must be faced. They must be acknowledged. Only then can they rest. It was simple wisdom, the kind that seemed obvious once spoken but had somehow eluded him for years. He thought about it after they left, returning to their camp with promises to visit again, to maintain the connection that bound them. He thought about the ghosts he carried, the faces of men he'd killed in war, the friends who'd died beside him, the choices he'd made that couldn't be unmade. Winter came, harder than usual, bringing snows that buried the desert in white and transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The cowboy holed up in his cabin, venturing out only when necessary to care for his horse and replenish supplies. He wore the deerskin shirt often, finding it warmer and more comfortable than anything he'd owned before. The carved object on his mantle became a focus during long evenings by the fire, a reminder that he was no longer entirely alone in the world. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and coaxing new life from the seemingly dead earth. The cowboy felt the restlessness return, the urge to move, to ride, to see what lay beyond the next horizon. But this time, when he considered his options, he found himself thinking about the camp 3 days to the east, about the people there, about the invitation that had been extended. He saddled his horse on a clear morning in April, packing light as he always did, and turned east. The journey took 4 days rather than 3, as he wasn't sure exactly where he was going and had to rely on landmarks the mother had described and his own sense of direction. But eventually he found it, a collection of lodges set in a protected valley near a spring, smoke rising from cook fires, people moving about their daily tasks. His arrival caused a stir. Warriors came forward, hands on weapons, faces set in hard expressions. But before any confrontation could develop, Dancing Wind appeared, calling out in her language. The mother followed, pushing through the gathered crowd, and when she reached him she smiled broadly. "You come," she said, as if his arrival had been expected. "You honor the bond. This is good." She led him through the camp, introducing him with a long string of words in her language that he couldn't follow. But he understood the reactions of those he met. Curiosity, mostly, mixed with respect and a certain wariness. He was an outsider, clearly, but one who had earned a place through actions that mattered to these people. The man who saved the daughters. The one who chose honor over fear. They fed him, a communal meal that involved dozens of people, all curious about this white man who'd been accepted into their midst. He tried foods he'd never tasted before, listened to conversations he couldn't understand, felt the weight of many eyes measuring and judging him. It should have been uncomfortable, and parts of it were, but mostly he felt something unexpected. Acceptance. These people knew his story, knew what he'd done, and had decided he was worthy of trust. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of orange and red, Dancing Wind approached him. She'd been quieter during the day, staying in the background, but now she settled beside where he sat and spoke softly. "My mother says you are troubled," she observed. "That you carry weight." He glanced at her, struck again by how much she'd changed since he'd first seen her half-dead in the desert. She'd grown stronger, more confident, her eyes bright with intelligence and life. She was beautiful in a way he tried not to notice, in a way that made him uncomfortable given the circumstances of their meeting. "Everyone carries weight," he said, deflecting. "It's part of living." "Some weights must be shared," she said. "This is what family is for. To help carry what one person cannot bear alone." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. The cowboy thought about her words, about the concept of family that these people held, so different from the isolated independence he'd cultivated. He thought about the bond that had been created that day in the desert, about how a single choice had opened doors he'd never known existed. Over the following weeks, the cowboy found himself drawn back to the camp repeatedly. At first he told himself it was simply curiosity, a desire to understand these people who had claimed him as one of their own. But gradually he admitted a deeper truth. He was building connections, forming friendships, finding something he'd been missing without realizing it. A sense of belonging. The men taught him their language, laughing good-naturedly at his clumsy pronunciation. They showed him hunting techniques that had been perfected over generations, ways of tracking game that seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. They invited him on expeditions into the mountains, where they sought game and gathered materials for tools and weapons. The cowboy, who had always prided himself on his wilderness skills, found himself learning constantly, discovering that his knowledge was narrow compared to the deep understanding these people possessed of the land they'd inhabited for centuries. The women accepted him more slowly, as was natural. He was still an outsider, still a representative of the people who threatened their way of life. But they saw how their men treated him, saw the respect shown by the mother who had first bound him to the tribe, and gradually they warmed. They allowed him to sit at their fires, to share their meals, to participate in the daily rhythms of camp life. Dancing Wind became his primary teacher in matters of language and culture. She had a gift for explanation, a patience with his mistakes, and a quick humor that made learning enjoyable rather than frustrating. They spent hours together, walking through the valley, sitting by the spring, conversing in a mixture of English and her language as his vocabulary slowly expanded. He learned the names of plants and animals, the words for concepts he'd never considered, the ways that language shaped how people saw the world. He also learned about her. She spoke of her childhood, of growing up in a world increasingly threatened by the expansion of settlers and soldiers. She described the traditional ways that were being lost, the knowledge that died with each elder, the constant pressure to abandon their lifestyle and submit to reservation life. She talked about her dreams, surprisingly similar to anyone's dreams. Safety for her family. A chance to live without constant fear. The opportunity to raise children in peace. The cowboy listened and found himself sharing his own stories in return. The strangeness of his life back east, so different from the frontier. The experiences of war that had scarred him more deeply than any physical wound. The years of drifting, searching for something he couldn't name. And slowly, talking to this young woman who listened with such attention, he began to understand himself better. He'd been running not from something but toward something. Toward this, perhaps. Toward a place where he might belong. Summer returned, bringing with it the brutal heat he'd endured the year before. But this time he weathered it within the camp, helping with the work that kept the community functioning. He hauled water, repaired lodges, assisted with the butchering of game. He made himself useful, earning his place not through the rescue that had brought him here but through daily contributions to the common good. It was during this time that he began to notice the way Dancing Wind looked at him. Small glances that lingered a moment too long. The way she always seemed to be nearby when work needed doing. The careful attention she paid to her appearance when he was expected. He tried to ignore these signs, uncomfortable with the implications. She was young, though certainly of marriageable age by the standards of her people. And she was Apache, a member of a culture he was only beginning to understand. Any romantic entanglement would be complicated beyond measure. Yet he couldn't deny his own growing feelings. The way his heart lifted when he saw her. The disappointment when she was occupied elsewhere. The pleasure he took in their conversations, in her laughter, in the moments of understanding that passed between them without need for words. He was developing feelings that went far beyond gratitude or friendship, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. The mother noticed, of course. Little escaped her sharp eyes. She called him aside one evening, away from the camp, to a place where they could talk privately. They sat on rocks overlooking the valley, watching the last light fade from the sky, before she spoke. "My daughter Dancing Wind," she said carefully. "You have feelings for her." It wasn't a question, so he didn't deny it. "Yes," he said simply. "I didn't mean for it to happen." She nodded slowly. "And she has feelings for you. This is clear to everyone." The cowboy felt his face heat. "I know it's complicated. I'm white, she's Apache. I'm older. There are 1,000 reasons why. The mother held up a hand, stopping him. You think I brought you here to scold? To forbid? She laughed softly. I brought you here to give permission. He stared at her, speechless. You saved my daughter's lives, she continued. You showed honor when honor was rare. You have proven yourself worthy many times over. If you wish to court Dancing Wind, if she wishes this also, I will not stand in the way. Some in the tribe will object, will say you are still an outsider. But I am her mother, and I say you are family. You have been family since that day in the desert. The cowboy struggled to find words. I don't want to cause problems for her. For you. I know how complicated this could be. Life is always complicated, the mother said with a shrug. The question is whether the complications are worth enduring for the sake of what you might gain. Only you and Dancing Wind can answer that. She left him there, alone with his thoughts and the vast expanse of stars emerging overhead. The cowboy sat for hours, turning the situation over in his mind. He thought about the objections that would come from both sides. White society would condemn him for taking an Indian wife. Some Apache would reject him as an interloper, unworthy of one of their women. Their children, if they had children, would belong fully to neither world. But he also thought about Dancing Wind's smile. The way she made him feel understood in ways no one else ever had. The future they might build together if they were brave enough to try. And he realized that the mother was right. The complications existed regardless of what he chose. The question was whether he had the courage to reach for happiness despite those complications. The next day, he sought out Dancing Wind. She was working with Morning Star, scraping a hide that would become clothing or shelter, and when she saw him approach, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, mixed with apprehension. He asked if they could walk together, and she agreed immediately, setting aside her work. They walked in silence for a time, leaving the camp behind, following a path that led up into the rocks surrounding the valley. When they were alone, with only the wind and the distant cry of a hawk for company, he stopped and turned to face her. I spoke with your mother last night, he began, suddenly unsure how to proceed. In his world, there were conventions for courtship, words that were expected, rituals that smoothed the way. But here, in this moment, those conventions felt meaningless. Dancing Wind waited, her dark eyes fixed on his face, and he saw that she understood. She knew what he was trying to say, was perhaps waiting to see if he had the courage to say it. I have feelings for you, he said finally, abandoning any attempt at eloquence. I know it's complicated. I know there are reasons why this might be difficult. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. For a moment she said nothing, and his heart sank. Then she smiled, an expression of pure joy that transformed her face. I have waited, she said softly. I have waited for you to see. To understand. I have had feelings for you since you brought us from the desert. You gave me life, and then you gave me reason to live. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers warm in his. They stood that way for a long moment, acknowledging silently the bond forming between them, stronger and more personal than the tribal bond that had first connected them. It won't be easy, he warned. People will talk. They'll say things. Let them talk, she said with a shake of her head. Words cannot hurt us if we are strong together. Over the following months, their relationship deepened. They spent every possible moment together, learning each other with the intensity of people who understand that what they have is precious and rare. He taught her more English, refined her understanding of the white world she would need to navigate if they stayed together. She taught him the deeper aspects of her culture, the spiritual beliefs and traditional stories that gave meaning to her people's existence. The camp watched their courtship with mixed reactions. Some, like the mother and Morning Star, were openly supportive, seeing in the cowboy a man who had proven his worth. Others were more skeptical, worried about what it meant to so fully accept an outsider into their midst. But none could deny that Dancing Wind was happy, that she glowed with a contentment that had been absent before. The cowboy proposed in the autumn, offering her not a ring, which meant nothing in her culture, but a horse he'd spent months training. A fine animal, strong and intelligent, the kind of gift that demonstrated both his commitment and his respect for her traditions. She accepted without hesitation, and her mother began preparations for a ceremony that would bind them together in the eyes of the tribe. The wedding was unlike anything the cowboy had experienced. It involved rituals he barely understood, words in a language he was still learning, symbols and gestures whose meanings ran deeper than explanation. But he felt the power of it, the way the community came together to witness and bless their union. He felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, the understanding that he was now formally part of this tribe, with all the obligations and privileges that entailed. When it was done, when the ceremonies had concluded and the feasting had ended, he and Dancing Wind retreated to the lodge that had been prepared for them. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep, and he marveled at the path his life had taken. A year ago he'd been alone, drifting, without purpose or connection. Now he had a wife, a family, a place in a community. All because he'd made one choice, one simple decision to value life over convenience. "What are you thinking?" Dancing Wind asked softly, her head resting on his chest. "That I'm grateful," he said. "That finding you and your sister in the desert was the best thing that ever happened to me." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My mother told me once that the spirits guide us to where we need to be. That everything happens for a purpose. I think she was right. You were meant to find us. We were meant to be together." He wanted to argue that life was random, that chance and circumstance explained everything without need for spiritual intervention. But lying there, with his wife in his arms and the certainty of belonging warming his chest, he found he couldn't deny the possibility. Perhaps there was a pattern to existence, a meaning that revealed itself only when you stopped fighting and let yourself be guided. Winter came again, his second with the tribe, but this time he weathered it not alone but surrounded by family. He and Dancing Wind settled into the rhythms of married life, learning to navigate the small conflicts and misunderstandings that came with joining two different backgrounds. He helped with the hunting and defense of the camp, earning respect from the warriors through his skill and courage. She managed their household, working alongside the other women, proud of the man she'd chosen. Spring brought complications. Soldiers arrived in the territory, pushing the Apache toward reservation land, making demands and threats. The tribe faced difficult decisions about whether to resist, to flee, or to submit. Tensions ran high, and the cowboy found himself in the awkward position of being both insider and outsider, trusted by some but viewed with suspicion by others who saw him as a potential spy or traitor. He proved his loyalty during a raid by white settlers intent on driving the tribe from the valley. When fighting broke out, he stood with the Apache warriors, defending the camp with the same fierce determination he'd once shown defending wagon trains and settlements. He took no pleasure in fighting against his own race, but his commitments were clear. These were his people now. Dancing Wind was his wife. He would protect them with his life if necessary. The raid was repelled, but at cost. Several warriors were wounded, one killed. The cowboy himself took a bullet in the shoulder, a painful wound that laid him up for weeks. Dancing Wind nursed him through the injury and the fever that followed, her patience and skill saving his life as surely as he'd once saved hers. In his delirium, he dreamed of the desert, of two girls lying in the sand, of the moment when he decided to stop rather than ride on. He dreamed of the carved object on his cabin's mantel, of the mother's bow, of the instant when his fate had been sealed. When he recovered, the tribe's attitude toward him had shifted noticeably. He was no longer the white outsider who'd been conditionally accepted. He was one of them, proven in battle, bound by blood spilled in their defense. Warriors who had been coolly polite became warm friends. Elders sought his counsel on matters relating to the white world. Children played around him without fear or hesitation. But the larger situation continued to deteriorate. The pressure from soldiers and settlers increased. The tribe faced the reality that their traditional way of life was ending, that the future held only submission or endless conflict. Long councils were held, debates that stretched through the night as leaders tried to chart a path forward that preserved some measure of dignity and autonomy. The cowboy attended these councils, speaking when asked but mostly listening and learning. He saw the impossible position his adopted people faced, caught between a world that no longer existed and a future they had not chosen. He felt helpless rage at the injustice of it, at the way history was grinding them down regardless of their courage or wisdom. It was Dancing Wind who helped him understand what he could not change and what he could influence. "We cannot stop what is coming," she said one night as they lay together in their lodge. "The white people are too many, too powerful. But we can survive. We can adapt. We can keep alive what matters most, even if we must change the forms." Her words helped him see a path forward. He couldn't stop the historical forces reshaping the West. But he could use his position as someone who walked between worlds to advocate for his adopted people, to ensure they received fair treatment, to protect them from the worst abuses of the transition that was coming. It wasn't much, but it was something. A purpose that went beyond mere survival. In the spring of his 3rd year with the tribe, Dancing Wind told him she was pregnant. The news filled him with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at the prospect of becoming a father. Fear about bringing a child into such an uncertain world. Wonder at the continuation of life despite everything working against it. He held his wife close, feeling the slight swell of her belly, and made silent promises to protect this child with everything he had. The baby was born in late autumn, a son who emerged squalling and healthy into a world that seemed determined to destroy everything his mother's people held dear. They named him in both traditions, giving him an Apache name that meant sunrise after storm and an English name, James, after the cowboy's father. The boy was beautiful, a perfect blend of both parents, and holding him the cowboy felt his heart crack open in ways he'd never experienced. Fatherhood changed him. The casual approach to danger that had characterized his younger years vanished, replaced by careful consideration of risks and consequences. He couldn't be reckless anymore, not when he had a son depending on his survival. He found himself thinking about the future in new ways, planning and preparing instead of simply drifting with events. As young James grew, the cowboy taught him everything he knew. Skills for surviving in the wild, tracking and hunting, reading the weather and the land. But Dancing Wind taught him just as much, ensuring their son knew his Apache heritage, understood the stories and beliefs of his mother's people, learned to see the world through eyes that respected all life as sacred. The boy grew strong and clever, quick to learn and eager to explore. Watching him play around the camp, accepted fully by both his Apache relatives and the few white traders who passed through, the cowboy saw hope for a future where divisions might heal. His son belonged to both worlds, could move between them with an ease impossible for his parents' generation. Perhaps that was the answer to the impossible tensions of the time. Not erasure of one culture by another, but blending, adaptation, synthesis. Years passed, bringing more changes. The tribe was eventually forced onto reservation land, though they negotiated terms that allowed some autonomy and preserved some traditional practices. The cowboy used his knowledge of white bureaucracy and law to help navigate the complex process, ensuring his people received better treatment than many tribes in similar situations. It wasn't victory, but it was survival with dignity intact. He and Dancing Wind had 2 more children, daughters who grew up in this new world where Apache traditions mixed with white influences. The family became a symbol within the tribe, proof that adaptation didn't mean surrender, that it was possible to honor the past while building a future. The cowboy, once a drifter without purpose or connection, found himself an elder statesman, sought out for advice and counsel by both Apache and whites. His cabin still stood, unused now for years, but he visited it occasionally, remembering the man he'd been before that day in the desert. The carved object remained on the mantel, gathering dust but still carrying the weight of the bond that had been formed so long ago. He would hold it sometimes, running his fingers over the familiar shapes, thinking about how a single choice had rewritten his entire existence. Dancing Wind asked him once, many years into their marriage, if he regretted the path his life had taken. They were sitting outside their home, watching their grandchildren play, gray now in each other's hair, lines etched deep in faces weathered by sun and time. Regret? He repeated, considering the question seriously. He thought about the life he might have lived. The freedom he'd given up. The simplicity he'd lost. The conflicts he'd endured because of his choice to cross the divide between cultures. Then he looked at his wife, at their children and grandchildren, at the community he'd helped preserve through impossible times. No, he said finally. No regrets. This has been a good life. Hard, but good. I found things I didn't even know I was looking for. She smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable ease of decades together. The spirits knew, she said. They guided you to us that day. They knew what you needed, what we needed. They knew we would be stronger together. As the sun set over the land they called home, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, the cowboy reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. From solitary drifter to husband and father. From outsider to honored member of the tribe. From man without purpose to someone whose life had meaning woven through with the lives of others. He thought about the two girls he'd found dying in the desert all those years ago. About the mother who had walked out of the morning mist to bind him to her family. About the carved object and the promise it represented. About the moment when he'd chosen to stop rather than ride on, to help rather than ignore, to risk rather than preserve safety. That choice had cost him the simple freedom he'd once prized. But it had given him something infinitely more valuable. It had given him love, family, purpose, and belonging. It had given him a story worth living, a legacy worth leaving. It had transformed him from a man drifting through life into someone anchored by bonds of honor and affection. As darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, he and Dancing Wind rose and walked slowly back toward their home. Inside, their family waited, multiple generations gathered around the evening fire. The cowboy, who had once believed himself destined for solitude, entered into the warm glow of their presence and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The desert wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the memories of all those who had walked these paths before. It carried the story of a lone cowboy who had risked everything for strangers and found his true self in the process. It carried the promise that even in the harshest landscapes, mercy could bloom. That honor could transcend the artificial divisions between peoples. That one person's choice to act with compassion could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict or measure. And somewhere in the darkness, if one listened carefully, one might hear the echo of two young girls' voices, calling out across the years. Calling gratitude for the man who had saved them. Calling blessing on the family he had built. Calling witness to the truth that sometimes destiny arrives not with thunder and lightning, but with a simple decision to stop when you could ride on, to help when you could ignore, to open your heart when you could keep it closed. The cowboy's story became legend within the tribe, passed down through generations as an example of the best possibilities between peoples. Long after he and Dancing Wind had passed into memory, their descendants continued to honor the bond that had been forged that day in the desert. The carved object became a family treasure, each generation learning its meaning, understanding the weight of the obligations and opportunities it represented. In the end, his choice had been both smaller and larger than he'd imagined in that moment when he'd first seen two figures lying in the sand. Smaller because it had simply been the right thing to do, requiring no special courage or wisdom, just basic human decency. Larger because its consequences had rippled outward in time and space, creating connections and possibilities that had reshaped not just his own life but the lives of everyone touched by his decision. The story of the cowboy who had risked everything to save two Apache girls became a testament to the power of individual choice. In a time of conflict and division, when hatred often seemed the easier path, he had chosen differently. And in that choice, he had discovered that the bonds we forge through compassion and honor are stronger than the divisions imposed by history and circumstance. That family is not just about blood, but about the commitments we make and keep. That home is not a place, but the people we choose to stand beside through whatever storms may come.